Lecture 2-1, Physical Evidence and the Crime Scene. Physical evidence is basically what a crime lab runs on. It encompasses any and all objects that establish that a crime has actually been committed and can link a crime to its victim or to the perpetrator. Forensic science begins at the crime scene. With proper training, police agencies ensure competent performance at the crime scene. In many jurisdictions, this task has been assigned to specialized technicians, the evidence technicians, or crime scene investigators. But if there is not available to them, then the police agency itself will have certain officers that are trained in collecting physical evidence. First thing that needs to be done when a officer approaches the scene is the officer has to preserve and protect the area to the best of his ability. The first responder has to acquire any medical assistance for any injured victims. If there is someone who is still alive and needs assistance, this has to be done first. The medical personnel do their best to avoid disturbing any evidence and approaching the victim in an indirect route as to not bother any information or any evidence that may be there. The second is that they need to detain any potential suspects or witnesses. So statements need to be taken from victims, witnesses, and if the suspect is still there, the suspect, it's him or herself. Third, they need to secure the crime scene to the greatest extent possible. The boundary is sealed off and guards are posted at the entry to the crime scene if needed. All civilians and unauthorized personnel are excluded from the crime scene. The secured area should include the area where the crime took place and surrounding areas where physical evidence may be located. Any personnel that is not required to be there, or anyone who is not directly linked to that crime is not permitted to enter into the crime scene. And then lastly, a call for any additional personnel needed, such as another officer or the forensic investigator, is then brought in. The securing of the crime scene is a critical step in the investigation. If the scene is not secured and preserved to the best of the ability, the evidence that is there can be compromised. If that's the case, then it can't be admissible in court. After determining the boundaries of the scene, point of entry and exit of the perpetrator needs to be determined. Any obvious evidence must be photographed and documented. An initial walkthrough of the scene is then done to identify any evidence that may appear, and a strategy for examining and documenting the entire scene is then developed. A detailed log needs to always be kept of the movements of people into and out of the crime scene. This includes names of people, time of entry and exit, because that could definitely come up in court to try and disprove a piece of evidence or a testimony. And investigators should never do anything that might alter the crime scene, including smoking, eating, drinking, littering. Any of that is completely off limits within a crime scene. Once the crime scene has been secured, there needs to be recording of the crime scene. And there is actually limited time to working crime scene in which it's completely untouched. Photography, sketches, and notes are the three methods used to record, and all three should be used. Again, depending on the case, personnel, money limitations, it may prohibit the use of photography at a crime site. However, that has been a growing factor that agencies use. Most important prerequisite for photographing a scene is to be in its unaltered conditions. Unless there's an injured person involved, objects must not be moved. If evidence has been moved or removed, it has to be documented, but it never can be re-entered into the scene. Digital photography is becoming used more and more and more, and investigators have the ability to use different resolutions of camera. A resolution is the minimum distance that must separate two objects for them to be viewed as a distinct object. So the higher the resolution, the more detail, the more sharpness. A standard camera with 4 megapixels can create a print of an 8x10 with clear imaging, which can then be used in court. But crime scene photographers usually use cameras with as many as 12 megapixels or more. And the higher the megapixels, the higher the resolution. But because of the fact that digital photos can be easily manipulated with computers, it creates criticism and concern within the forensic case workings of photographing the scene. Because of this, jurisdictions have set guidelines and strict protocol for photographic evidence. The photographic procedures that need to or are taking place is each crime scene should be photographed as completely as possible. There needs to be an overall scene and then work down into individual pieces of evidence. So there are 4 minimum photos that are required: overview, a medium range photo, close-up photo, and close-up photos with scales. The overview photo is the entire scene and surrounding areas that are taken from various angles, including the point of exit and entry. And this is taken from outside the borders of the scene. If a body is present, photo must show body position and location relative to the entire scene. And this also includes any adjacent rooms if it is an indoor crime scene. The medium range photos show a layout of smaller significant areas of the crime. Ones with evidence markers should be taken to show the spatial relationship between and among evidence in greater detail. At least one medium range photo from the center of the scene should be taken. And in violent crime scenes, photos where the victim was found and the surrounding areas must be included. For the close-up photographs, it needs to be taken last and show greater detail of individual objects or evidence. Close-up photos must be taken at a 90-degree angle to the object, with and without markers or scales. After the photos from other angles may be taken as well, but there has to be a 90-degree angle photo. Having scales placed as close to evidence as possible without affecting it. Depictions of the injuries, weapons laying near the body, and that's probably the most important photos. Once the body is removed, the underneath surface of the body, where the body was, needs to be taken as well to show if there's any evidence there. Remember that all of these photos are to help refresh the investigators or the crime lab's memory of what occurred at that scene, what that scene looked like, what was there. Videotaping is also becoming more and more popular due to the fact that video cameras are becoming cheaper and cheaper. The same principles as photography are applied to videotaping, so they must include those 4 angles: the overview, medium range, and close-up range. A narrative crime scene video is desired if possible, but it's important that only one person is narrating and one is recording, that there's no side conversations that are being captured at the same time. The next step in recording the scene is going to be a rough crime scene sketch, and this is created at the scene. It contains an accurate depiction of the dimensions of the scene and shows location of all pertinent objects and features. All rough sketches show all recovered items located by distant measurements from two fixed points, which is basically like the walls. So you have to have it at it's a distance from two walls. Distance must be accurate and made with a tape measure. The simplest way to designate an item is to assign it a number or letter, and then a legend is made to identify the item and the dimension. A compass always needs to show which direction is north, and then a title block with information on the case, the crime scene, the person creating the sketch, location, and so on. So this is a rough sketch. As you can see, it's nothing pretty, but it definitely has the measurements. It has the location of all of the items that were found, as well as all of the fixed items that were in there, the couch, the desk, the phone, the table, lamps, and so on. The finished crime scene sketch is created from the information on the rough sketch, but is drawn to scale with care and concern for appearance. And so this is typically done back at the office, back at the lab, but there's a current standard of creating finished sketches using computer-aided drafting programs, or CADs, and these can also be used to create a finished or three-dimensional finished sketch, which is helpful in the investigation process. And so this is a finished sketch where it looks still everything that was in the rough sketch is here in the finished sketch. It's just a little bit more polished. And then the last bit of recording is the crime scene notes, and notes should be taken in constant activity throughout the process of the crime scene. They should include detailed written descriptions of the scene with locations of items. They should include the time the item was discovered, by who it was discovered, also how and who packaged and marked the evidence, and what that item looked like after it was collected. Was there any changes in it? And then recorded notes can also be very useful, but they have to be transcribed later, so it can't rely on just the recording. And this is the preservation and documenting of a crime lab. There will be a quiz next class.